The rope moved through Eleanor Nash's calloused fingers like water flowing downstream, each strand finding its place in the intricate pattern she had been perfecting since her father taught her the craft 15 years ago. Mineral Park, Arizona slept around her under the blanket of stars that stretched endlessly across the high desert sky. But Eleanor remained wide awake on the wooden bench outside the boarding house where she worked, her hands never still, her mind focused on the complex braid that was taking shape under the pale moonlight of this July night in 1881. She had always been drawn to the quiet hours when the rest of the world surrendered to sleep. During the day, she served meals to dusty miners and weary travelers, scrubbed floors until her knees ached, and laundered sheets that smelled of sweat and whiskey. But midnight belonged to her alone, those precious hours when she could lose herself in the rhythm of rope work, creating patterns that her father had learned from Mexican vaqueros during his years working cattle ranches across the Southwest. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Harriet Blackwell, thought it peculiar that a 22-year-old woman would choose to sit outside braiding rope when she could be sleeping. But Eleanor had long ago stopped caring what others thought of her habits. The sound of boots on packed earth made her glance up from her work. A tall figure emerged from the shadows cast by the saloon across the street, moving with the easy gait of a man comfortable in his own skin. As he stepped into the pool of lamplight spilling from the boarding house window, Eleanor could see he was young, perhaps 24 or 25, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of stubble shadowing his jaw. Dust covered his clothing from his worn hat down to his spurred boots, and he carried himself with the particular weariness of someone who had spent too many hours in the saddle. He paused when he noticed her sitting there, his hand moving instinctively toward his hip before he realized she posed no threat. Then his gaze dropped to the rope in her hands, watching the fluid motion of her fingers as they wove and twisted the strands into an increasingly complex pattern. Eleanor kept working, accustomed to curious stares from the miners and cowboys who passed through Mineral Park. Most people looked for a moment and then moved on, but this man stood there longer, his attention fixed on the braiding with an intensity that made her fingers slow slightly. "Evening," he finally said, his voice carrying the distinctive drawl of Texas. "That is some impressive work you are doing there." Eleanor nodded but did not respond verbally, continuing her braiding. She had learned through experience that acknowledging strangers too warmly often led to unwanted advances or inappropriate conversation. Better to remain polite but distant, to let them pass on to wherever they were headed. But this cowboy did not move on. Instead, he took a few steps closer, careful to maintain a respectful distance, and tilted his head to better observe the pattern forming in her hands. "I have been working cattle for 10 years, he said, "and I have never seen anyone braid rope like that. That looks like it would hold strong under serious weight." Despite herself, Eleanor felt a flicker of pride. She knew her work was good, had been told so by experienced vaqueros and ranch hands, but compliments were rare enough that she still appreciated them when they came from someone who clearly understood the craft. "It will hold," she confirmed, her voice quiet but confident. "My father taught me the pattern. He said it came from somewhere down in Mexico, passed between horsemen for generations." The cowboy nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the rope. "Would you mind if I watched for a moment? I have been trying to improve my rope work for years, but I can never get beyond the basic 4-strand braid." Eleanor hesitated. It was late, and she treasured her solitude during these midnight hours. But something in the man's voice suggested genuine interest rather than pretense, and she found herself gesturing toward the other end of the bench. "You can sit if you want," she said, the words emerging before she could reconsider them. He moved forward carefully, removing his hat as he sat down, keeping a proper distance between them that spoke of good manners despite his rough appearance. Up close, Eleanor could see his eyes were a warm brown, watching her hands with complete focus as she continued the braid. The rope was beginning to take its final form now, a 6-strand pattern that created a diamond-shaped design running the length of the cord. "I am James Xavier," he said after a moment, still watching her fingers. "Just rode in from the Lazy S Ranch about 40 miles south. I am looking for work, heard they might be hiring hands at the copper mines here." "Eleanor Nash," she replied, surprised by her willingness to share even that small piece of information. "I work at this boarding house. The mines are always looking for workers, though the pay is not as good as they claim, and the conditions are worse than you can imagine." James glanced up at her face for the first time, and she noticed the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. "Cannot be worse than some of the places I have worked," he said, "though I would rather wrangle cattle than dig in the earth. Unfortunately, there is not much ranch work available right now. Drought has been hard on the herds this year." Eleanor nodded, aware of the difficulties facing ranchers throughout the territory. The past 2 summers had been brutally dry, with water sources dwindling and grass turning brown too early in the season. Many smaller ranches had been forced to sell off their herds or shut down entirely, leaving experienced cowboys scrambling for whatever work they could find. She finished the section she had been working on and held up the braided rope for James to examine more closely. In the lamplight, the pattern was clearly visible, each strand interlocking with the others in a way that distributed tension evenly across the entire braid. "The key is keeping consistent pressure," she explained, surprised by her own willingness to share the technique. "If one strand gets too tight or too loose, the whole pattern becomes unbalanced and weakens." James reached out tentatively, and Eleanor handed him the rope. He ran his fingers over the braid, testing its strength gently, examining how the strands wove together. "This is beautiful," he said, and she could hear the genuine admiration in his voice. "Not just functional, but beautiful. How long did it take you to learn this?" "Years," Eleanor admitted. "My father started teaching me when I was 7 years old. He said a person could never know when they would need a good rope, and knowing how to make and repair your own meant you would never be left helpless." Her voice caught slightly on the memory. Her father had been dead for 3 years now, killed in a mining accident in Tombstone, but she still felt his presence every time she picked up a rope. James must have heard something in her tone, because he looked at her with understanding rather than pity. "Sounds like he was a wise man," he said simply, handing the rope back to her. "He was," Eleanor agreed, taking the rope and beginning a new section. "He taught me everything practical he could think of. How to braid rope, mend saddles, treat sick animals, read the weather, survive on limited supplies. He said a woman needed to know how to take care of herself because the world was not set up to take care of her." "He was right about that," James said. "I have met too many women left helpless when their husbands or fathers died, with no skills to support themselves and no one willing to teach them." He paused, then added carefully, "Though I imagine some men prefer women that way. Easier to control someone who depends on you entirely." Eleanor glanced at him sharply, trying to determine if he was being sincere or manipulative, but his expression seemed genuinely thoughtful. "My father was not like that," she said. "He believed everyone should be capable, regardless of whether they wore trousers or skirts." "Smart man," James repeated. He watched her hands for another moment, then asked, "Would you be willing to teach me? How to do that braid, I mean. I would pay you for your time if that would be appropriate." Eleanor's fingers stilled on the rope. She had never taught anyone her father's patterns before, had guarded them almost jealously as one of the few precious things she had left of him. But something about James Xavier's earnest request, his obvious respect for the craft, made her consider the possibility. Her father had never said the knowledge should die with her. In fact, he had often spoken of the importance of passing skills from one generation to the next, keeping valuable techniques alive through willing students. "I do not need payment," she said slowly, "but I work long hours during the day. The only time I have for rope work is late at night, after my duties at the boarding house are finished." "I do not sleep much anyway," James said. "Too many years of keeping watch over cattle in unfamiliar territory. My body is used to staying alert when most folks are dreaming." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing the risk of inviting this stranger into her private midnight hours against the unexpected appeal of having someone to share her father's craft with. Finally, she made her decision. "Tomorrow night," she said, "if you are still in town, meet me here at midnight and bring your own rope. You need to feel the pattern in your own hands, not just watch someone else do it." James's face broke into a genuine smile, the first she had seen from him, and it transformed his tired features into something warmer and more open. "I will be here," he promised. "Thank you, Miss Nash. This means more to me than you might realize." He stood then, settling his hat back on his head, and Eleanor found herself hoping he truly would return. She had grown so accustomed to solitude that she had forgotten how pleasant it could be to share an interest with someone who genuinely appreciated it. As James walked away toward the small hotel further down the street, Eleanor returned her attention to her rope, but her mind was no longer entirely focused on the pattern. Instead, she found herself wondering about the Texas cowboy who had sat down beside her at midnight and asked to learn something most men would have dismissed as unimportant. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Eleanor moved through her usual tasks at the boarding house, serving breakfast to the handful of permanent residents, changing linens, scrubbing the front steps, preparing and serving dinner, but her mind kept drifting to the evening ahead. She told herself it was simply the novelty of having a student, the opportunity to pass on her father's knowledge, but there was something else mixed in with those practical thoughts. Something about James Xavier's respectful manner, his genuine interest, the way he had looked at her rope work with such focused attention. Mrs. Blackwell noticed her distraction during the dinner service. "You seem miles away today, Eleanor," the older woman said, her sharp eyes missing nothing as always. "Is something troubling you?" "No, madam," Eleanor replied quickly. "Just thinking about a project I am working on. That rope braiding of yours, Mrs." Blackwell shook her head, though not unkindly. "I will never understand why you spend your free time on such things, but I suppose every person needs a pastime. Just make sure you get enough sleep. I cannot have you falling asleep over the breakfast dishes." Eleanor assured her employer that she would rest properly, though she knew she had no intention of going to bed any earlier than usual. The midnight hours were too precious, too much her own, to surrender them to something as mundane as additional sleep. When her duties finally ended and the boarding house grew quiet, Eleanor went to her small room and retrieved the coil of rope she kept beneath her narrow bed. She also pulled out a second rope, one she had been preparing for a new project, and carried both downstairs to her usual spot on the bench outside. The Arizona night was clear and warm, the air still holding the heat of the day but comfortable enough at this elevation. Mineral Park sat at nearly 4,000 feet, high enough that summer nights remained bearable even when the days grew scorching. She had just settled onto the bench and begun organizing her materials when she heard footsteps approaching. James emerged from the shadows, carrying a coil of rope over his shoulder and looking considerably cleaner than he had the previous night. He had shaved and found fresh clothing somewhere, though the garments were just as worn and patched as yesterday's had been. "Miss Nash," he greeted her, touching his hat brim politely. "I hope I am not late." Eleanor glanced at the position of the moon, judging the time as her father had taught her. "Right on time," she confirmed. "Did you find work at the mines?" James made a face as he sat down beside her, this time without asking permission, though he maintained the same respectful distance. "I found work," he said, "but you were right about the conditions. I spent today learning the operations, and I will start underground tomorrow. It is going to be miserable, but the pay is decent enough if I can stand it for a few months." "Most men do not last more than a season," Eleanor told him honestly. "The dust gets into your lungs and the darkness wears on your mind." "My father made it 2 years before he said he would rather starve than go back underground." "What did he do instead?" James asked, setting his rope on the bench between them. "He worked cattle when he could find it, took odd jobs, hired out as a freighter hauling supplies between settlements. Whatever paid enough to keep us fed and housed." Eleanor picked up the rope James had brought and examined it critically. The quality was decent, the hemp properly treated and flexible enough for braiding. "This will work," she said. "Now show me what you already know." "Let me see your basic 4-strand braid." James took the rope and began working, his large hands moving with practiced efficiency through the familiar pattern. Eleanor watched carefully, noting that his technique was solid if unimaginative, exactly what one would expect from someone who had learned rope work solely for practical ranch purposes rather than as an art form. "Good," she said when he had completed a section. "Your tension is consistent and the spacing is even. That gives us a strong foundation to build on." She undid his braid and handed the rope back. "Now I am going to show you how to add 2 more strands to create the 6-strand diamond pattern. It is more complex, but the principle is the same. You need to think of the rope as creating a spiral, with each strand following a specific path around the others." For the next hour, Eleanor guided James through the basic mechanics of the pattern. He proved to be an attentive student, asking questions when he did not understand and practicing sections repeatedly, until his hands remembered the motion. She found herself enjoying the process more than she had anticipated, discovering that teaching required her to articulate techniques she had long since internalized, to break down movements that had become automatic back into their component parts. "My fingers feel like they are tying themselves in knots," James admitted after his 5th attempt to complete a full rotation of the pattern ended in a tangled mess. Eleanor could not help but smile. "It takes time," she assured him. "When I was learning, I spent weeks getting everything wrong before it suddenly made sense. Your hands need to develop memory, to learn the movement so well that you can do it without thinking." "Did your father get frustrated teaching you?" James asked, beginning to untangle the rope again. "Sometimes," Eleanor admitted. "He was a patient man, but everyone has limits. I remember one afternoon when I had made the same mistake for the 20th time, and he finally said he needed to walk away before he said something he would regret. He came back an hour later with fresh perspective and a new way of explaining the technique that finally made it click for me." James looked up from his work, his expression thoughtful. "You must miss him terribly." The simple statement, delivered without drama or excessive sympathy, somehow hit Eleanor harder than more elaborate condolences ever had. "Every day," she said quietly. "He was the only family I had. When he died, I felt like I had lost my place in the world. No home, no family, no clear path forward. I ended up here because Mrs. Blackwell was willing to hire me, and Mineral Park seemed as good a place as any to try to build a new life." "Have you succeeded?" James asked. "Building a new life, I mean." Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I have built a life," she said finally. "Whether it is the one I would have chosen, I cannot say, but I have work, a place to sleep, enough food to eat. That is more than many people can claim." "But is it enough for you?" James pressed gently. No one had ever asked her that before, and Eleanor found herself unsettled by the question. She had spent 3 years focused entirely on survival, on getting through each day, on maintaining her position at the boarding house. She had not allowed herself to consider whether mere survival constituted a satisfactory existence. "It has to be," she said, more sharply than she intended. "Now, stop trying to distract me with personal questions and focus on your rope work. You are never going to learn this pattern if you do not practice." James accepted the rebuke gracefully, returning his attention to the braid. They worked in companionable silence for a while, with Eleanor occasionally reaching over to adjust his hand position or demonstrate a particular movement. The town remained quiet around them, most of Mineral Park's residents long since retired for the night. Occasionally, they would hear drunken laughter from one of the saloons or the distant bark of a dog, but otherwise, the world felt very small and private, reduced to just the two of them and the ropes in their hands. As the night wore on, James's skill improved noticeably. The braid was still far from perfect, but he was beginning to grasp the fundamental rhythm of the pattern, his fingers moving with increasing confidence through the complex sequence. Eleanor found herself impressed by his determination, the way he refused to become frustrated despite repeated mistakes, simply untangling the mess and starting again with renewed focus. "You are a good teacher," James said suddenly, completing a full rotation without error for the first time. "Patient and clear, that is a valuable skill." Eleanor felt warmth rise to her cheeks at the compliment. "My father was a good teacher," she corrected. "I am just passing on what he taught me." "No," James disagreed, holding up the rope to show her his progress. "You have your own way of explaining things, your own methods. That comes from you, not from him. You should take credit for your own abilities." The comment struck Eleanor as oddly perceptive, revealing an emotional intelligence she had not expected from a roughneck cowboy looking for mining work. She studied James more carefully in the lamplight, seeing past the worn clothing and calloused hands to the thoughtful person beneath. "How did you end up alone and looking for work in Arizona?" she asked, curious now about his story. "Where is your family?" James's hand stilled on the rope, and a shadow passed across his face. "Dead," he said simply. "My parents died of fever when I was 14. I had an older brother who took me in, taught me the cattle trade. He was killed 3 years ago in a stampede. After that, I just kept moving, working where I could find it, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots." "So we are both orphans," Eleanor said softly. "Both drifting." "I suppose we are," James agreed. He looked at her directly, and in his eyes, she saw a reflection of her own loneliness, the particular isolation that came from having no one in the world who shared your history or cared about your future. "Though maybe we do not have to drift alone." The comment hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor's first instinct was to retreat, to rebuild the walls she had carefully constructed around her heart over the past 3 years. But something held her in place, kept her from immediately shutting down the tentative connection forming between them. "We barely know each other," she pointed out, though her voice lacked conviction. "True enough," James acknowledged. "But I know you are someone who sits outside at midnight braiding rope, because it brings you closer to your father's memory." I know you are skilled and patient and willing to share your knowledge with a stranger. I know you work hard and do not complain about your circumstances, even when they are difficult. That is more than I have known about most people I have spent months working alongside. Eleanor wanted to argue, to point out all the things he did not know about her, all the ways she might disappoint him if given the chance. But the words would not come. Instead, she found herself asking, "What do I know about you?" James smiled slightly. "You know I am willing to work in a copper mine to earn money, even though the idea terrifies me. You know I care enough about improving my skills to seek out a teacher and practice diligently. You know I am honest enough to admit when I do not understand something. And you know I see the value in what you do, even though most men would dismiss rope braiding as unimportant women's work." "It is not women's work," Eleanor said automatically. "It is necessary work, and gender has nothing to do with ability." "Exactly," James agreed. "Which is another thing I know about you. You do not accept arbitrary limitations based on irrelevant characteristics." Despite herself, Eleanor felt a smile tugging at her lips. "You think very highly of yourself, drawing all these conclusions from a couple of conversations." "I prefer to think I am observant," James countered. "But if you believe I am wrong about any of it, please correct me." Eleanor wanted to find fault with his assessments, but honesty compelled her to admit he had read her fairly accurately. "You are not wrong," she conceded. "Though I reserve the right to prove you wrong about other things as we continue these lessons." "So we are continuing the lessons?" James asked, and she could hear the hope in his voice. "You have not mastered the six-strand diamond yet," Eleanor pointed out. "It would be irresponsible of me to leave you half-taught." "Irresponsible," James repeated, his smile growing. "Well, we certainly cannot have that. I suppose you are stuck with me for a while longer then." "I suppose I am," Eleanor agreed, and found the prospect considerably less burdensome than she would have imagined 24 hours earlier. They continued working until the position of the stars indicated it was nearing 2 in the morning. James had improved significantly, though he was still far from achieving the smooth, even braid that came from years of practice. Eleanor finally called a halt, aware that he needed to be at the mine before dawn, and she had to be up early to prepare breakfast for the boarding house residents. "Tomorrow night?" James asked as he stood, coiling his rope carefully. "Tomorrow night," Eleanor confirmed. "Same time, same place." She watched him walk away into the darkness, then gathered her own materials and headed inside. Her small room was stifling after the coolness of the night air, but Eleanor barely noticed as she lay down on her narrow bed. Her mind was too full of the evening's conversation, replaying moments and analyzing words, trying to understand the strange flutter in her chest whenever she thought about James Xavier's earnest brown eyes and careful hands. Sleep came slowly, and when it finally arrived, it brought dreams of her father teaching her to braid rope while a tall cowboy watched from the shadows, his presence somehow comforting rather than threatening. The pattern repeated itself over the following weeks. Eleanor worked her long days at the boarding house, and James labored underground in the copper mine, both of them going through the motions of their ordinary lives while anticipating the midnight hours when they could meet on the bench outside and lose themselves in rope work. James's skill improved steadily, his hands growing more confident with the patterns, his questions becoming more sophisticated as he began to understand the underlying principles that governed the braiding. But the lessons evolved into something more than simple instruction. They talked while they worked, sharing stories from their pasts, discussing their observations about Mineral Park and its residents, debating everything from politics to religion to the best way to treat rope burn. Eleanor discovered that James had taught himself to read as a teenager, borrowing books from anyone willing to lend them, and studying by firelight after long days of ranch work. He had strong opinions about literature and could quote passages from Shakespeare and Cervantes with surprising accuracy. "My brother thought I was foolish," James admitted one night in early August. "Said reading would not help me rope a steer or break a horse, but I always felt like there was more to life than just surviving, that a person should try to expand their mind even if their circumstances were limited." "My father felt the same way," Eleanor said. "He could not read much himself, but he made sure I learned. Said ignorance was a choice, not an inevitability, and he would not have a daughter who chose to remain ignorant." "He sounds like he was a remarkable man," James observed. "He was," Eleanor agreed. "Though he was not perfect. He drank too much sometimes, and he could be stubborn to the point of foolishness. But he loved me, and he prepared me to survive on my own. That is more than many daughters can say about their fathers." James nodded, his fingers working through a particularly complex section of braid. "My brother was the same way. Flawed but devoted. He gave up a lot to take care of me after our parents died. Could have married, started his own family, but he said I was his responsibility and he would not shirk it." "Do you feel guilty?" Eleanor asked quietly. "That he sacrificed his chances for your sake?" "Every day," James admitted. "Especially after he died. I kept thinking about all the things he gave up, all the life he could have lived if he had not been burdened with a younger brother. But then I remember him saying once that family is not a burden, it is a privilege. He chose to take care of me, and that choice gave his life meaning and purpose." Eleanor considered his words, thinking about her own father's sacrifices. "He could have remarried after her mother died in childbirth, could have found a woman to help raise his daughter and provide companionship. But he had chosen to remain alone, to pour all his energy into teaching Eleanor everything he knew. I suppose we honor them by living well," she said finally. "By using what they taught us and not wasting the opportunities their sacrifices created." "Is that what you are doing here?" James asked. "Living well." The question echoed his earlier inquiry about whether her life in Mineral Park was enough. This time, Eleanor did not deflect. "I am surviving," she said honestly. "But I do not know if that is the same as living well. I exist from one day to the next, doing my work competently, causing no trouble, making no waves. Is that really honoring my father's memory? Or am I just letting fear keep me small and safe?" James set down his rope and turned to face her fully. "What would you do," he asked carefully, "if fear was not a factor? If you could shape your life however you wanted, what would it look like?" No one had ever asked Eleanor that question, and she found herself momentarily speechless. She had spent so long focused on survival that she had stopped imagining alternatives, stopped dreaming about possibilities. But now, sitting in the warm August night with James Xavier watching her expectantly, she let herself consider the question seriously. "I would have a ranch," she said slowly, the dream taking shape even as she spoke it aloud. "Nothing fancy, but enough land to raise cattle and horses. I would breed animals known for their quality, earn a reputation for fair dealing and superior stock. I would teach others the skills my father taught me, pass on knowledge to the next generation. And I would wake up every morning knowing the work I did mattered, that I was building something lasting rather than just surviving day to day." James listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "That is a good dream," he said when she finished. "Specific and achievable. Have you ever tried to make it happen?" Eleanor shook her head. "It takes money to start a ranch, even a small one. Money for land, for stock, for supplies and equipment. I have been saving what I can from my wages, but at the rate I am accumulating funds, I will be 60 years old before I have enough." "What if you had a partner?" James asked. "Someone to share the costs and the work?" Eleanor's heart began to beat faster, sensing the direction of the conversation. "Partners require trust," she said carefully, "and trust requires time to develop." "How much time?" James pressed. "We have been meeting nearly every night for a month now. We know each other's stories, each other's dreams and fears. At what point does caution become an excuse for staying stuck?" The directness of the question startled Eleanor. She looked at James, really looked at him, seeing not just the tired cowboy who had sat down beside her at midnight 6 weeks ago, but the man he had revealed himself to be through hours of conversation and shared silence. She saw someone honest and hardworking, someone who valued knowledge and skill, someone who treated her as an equal rather than a subordinate. She saw someone who might actually be capable of helping her build the life she had just described, but she also saw the risk. Partnerships could go wrong in countless ways. People changed their minds, circumstances shifted, conflicts arose that seemed manageable at first but grew into insurmountable obstacles. Was she really willing to bet her carefully hoarded savings and her fragile dreams on a man she had known for only 6 weeks? "I do not know," she said honestly. "I want to believe it could work, but I have been alone and self-reliant for so long that the idea of depending on someone else terrifies me." "I am not asking you to depend on me," James clarified. "I am suggesting we depend on each other. There is a difference. Dependence implies weakness and subordination. Interdependence implies partnership and mutual support." "You have thought about this," Eleanor observed. "I have," James admitted. "I started thinking about it the second night we met, when you corrected my hand position on the braid, and I realized how much I enjoyed being around you. The thoughts have only intensified since then." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. They had danced around the attraction growing between them for weeks, acknowledged it in glances and small gestures but never speaking it aloud. Now James had broken that unspoken agreement, had put words to the thing they had both been feeling, and Eleanor could no longer pretend she did not understand where this was heading. "I enjoy being around you too," she said quietly. "More than I have enjoyed anyone's company since my father died." But enjoyment is not the same as love, and partnerships built solely on mutual attraction tend to crumble when the initial excitement fades. "True," James agreed, "but we have more than just attraction. We have shared interests, compatible values, complementary skills. We make each other think and challenge each other to be better. That is a stronger foundation than most marriages start with, let alone business partnerships." "So what exactly are you proposing?" Eleanor asked, needing to hear him state it explicitly. James took a deep breath, and in the lamplight, she could see nervousness in his expression for the first time since they had met. "I am proposing that we become partners in every sense of the word. That we pool our resources and skills, find a piece of land we can afford, and start building the ranch you described. And I am proposing that we do it as husband and wife, because I cannot imagine wanting to build a life with anyone else." The words hung in the air between them, monumental and terrifying and thrilling all at once. Eleanor's mind raced through 1,000 objections and considerations, but beneath all the practical concerns, she felt something else rising up. Hope. The fragile, dangerous hope that maybe she could have more than just survival, that maybe the life she had described was not just a dream but a genuine possibility. "That is a lot to propose after 6 weeks," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "It is," James acknowledged. "And if you need more time, I will wait. I am not trying to rush you into something you are not ready for, but I also do not want to waste time pretending I do not know what I want when I do know. I want to build a life with you, Eleanor Nash. I want to wake up every morning and work beside you and go to sleep every night knowing we are building something together. I want to teach our children to braid rope and work cattle and think for themselves. I want 50 years of midnight conversations and shared dreams and challenges overcome together. Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes, emotions she had suppressed for 3 years suddenly overwhelming her defenses. "What if it does not work?" she whispered. "What if we fail?" "Then we fail together," James said simply. "And we figure out what comes next. But Eleanor, what if we succeed? What if we build exactly the life you described, the life your father prepared you for? Is not that possibility worth the risk?" Eleanor thought about her father, about the lessons he had taught her, and the skills he had insisted she master. He had not raised her to play it safe, to accept a life of drudgery and limitation simply because it was secure. He had raised her to be capable and independent, yes, but also to recognize genuine opportunities when they appeared. And James Xavier, sitting beside her at midnight with hope and fear mingled in his honest brown eyes, represented an opportunity she might never encounter again. "Yes," she said, the word emerging as barely more than a breath. "Yes, it is worth the risk." James's face transformed with joy, and before Eleanor quite knew what was happening, he had taken her hands in his, the rope falling forgotten to the bench between them. "You mean it?" he asked. "You will marry me. You will build this life with me." "I will," Eleanor confirmed, and saying the words aloud made them feel real and solid and right. "Though we should probably court properly for at least a few more weeks before we actually get married. I would like people to believe we made a reasoned decision rather than an impulsive one." James laughed, the sound full of relief and happiness. "We can court as long as you want," he promised, "though I suspect we have already done most of our courting right here on this bench at midnight." He was right, Eleanor realized. They had shared more honest conversation in their 6 weeks of midnight meetings than many couples managed in years of conventional courtship. They knew each other's dreams and fears, strengths and weaknesses. They had already seen each other tired and frustrated, had already worked through disagreements and found common ground. What they had built was unusual but authentic, and Eleanor felt certain it would prove more durable than relationships based on superficial charm and careful pretense. "We need to make a plan," she said, her practical nature reasserting itself. "Figure out exactly how much money we have between us, research what land is available, determine what we can realistically afford." "Tomorrow," James said. "We can start planning tomorrow." "Tonight, can we just sit here and enjoy the fact that we are not facing the future alone anymore?" Eleanor nodded, and they sat together in comfortable silence, hands still clasped, while the stars wheeled slowly overhead and Mineral Park slept around them. For the first time in 3 years, Eleanor felt something other than grim determination or weary acceptance. She felt possibility unfurling like a flower after rain, felt hope taking root in soil she had thought too depleted to nurture anything. The next weeks were a blur of activity. James gave notice at the mine, enduring his final days underground with better humor now that he knew his time there was limited. Eleanor continued her work at the boarding house, while spending every spare moment researching available land and calculating costs. They met each night at midnight, now spending more time planning than practicing rope work, though they always made time for at least a little braiding. Mrs. Blackwell noticed the change in Eleanor's demeanor almost immediately. "You seem different lately," the older woman observed one afternoon. "Lighter somehow. Has something happened?" Eleanor hesitated, then decided the truth would emerge soon enough anyway. "I am engaged," she said, "to James Xavier. We are planning to start a ranch together once we have saved enough money." Mrs. Blackwell's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "James Xavier, the cowboy who has been sitting outside with you at midnight. Eleanor, You have known him less than 2 months. I know, Eleanor said, but I also know he is honest and hardworking and shares my values. We want the same things from life and we work well together. That seems like a better foundation for marriage than many couples have. Mrs. Blackwell looked skeptical but not disapproving. I suppose that is true enough, she admitted, and Lord knows you have been alone long enough. Just make sure you are making this decision with your head as well as your heart. Ranching is brutal work, and partnerships can fall apart under that kind of pressure. I understand the risks, Eleanor assured her, but I also understand the alternative. I could stay here working at the boarding house until I am too old to be useful, saving my pennies and dreaming about the life I might have had. Or I could take a chance on building something real with someone who wants to build it alongside me. The choice seems clear. Mrs. Blackwell studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. When you put it that way, I suppose it does. Just promise me you will invite me to visit once you get your ranch established. I would like to see how the story ends. I promise, Eleanor said, touched by the sentiment. She had not realized Mrs. Blackwell cared enough to be invested in her future. Meanwhile, James was facing similar conversations with the men he worked alongside at the mine. Most were skeptical of his plans, pointing out the countless ways a small ranch operation could fail and leave him worse off than he started. But a few offered genuine encouragement and practical advice, sharing lessons learned from their own attempts at ranching or from family members who had succeeded where others failed. The key is water, an older miner named Tom Wheeler told James one day. You can survive bad grass years if you have reliable water. Find land with a good spring or a creek that runs year-round, and you have got a fighting chance. James filed away that information along with dozens of other suggestions and warnings. He and Eleanor were learning quickly that starting a ranch required far more than just desire and determination. They needed knowledge about soil quality, water rights, land prices, cattle breeds, horse training, feed costs, equipment expenses, and 100 other factors that could make the difference between success and failure. It is overwhelming, Eleanor admitted one night in mid-September, surrounded by papers covered with calculations and notes. Every time I think we have accounted for everything, I discover 3 more things we had not considered. So we learn as we go, James said. We start small, make mistakes on a scale we can recover from, and build slowly. That is how most successful ranches get started. Most successful ranches get started by people who inherited land and stock from their families, Eleanor corrected. We are starting from nothing. Not nothing, James disagreed. We have skills and knowledge and determination. We have each other. That is considerably more than nothing. Eleanor wanted to believe him, but the practical obstacles seemed to multiply every day. The land they could afford was either too remote to be practical, or of such poor quality that ranching would be nearly impossible. The stock they could purchase was either too old, too young, or too poorly bred to form a foundation herd. The equipment they needed was prohibitively expensive, and buying used meant risking breakdown at critical moments. Maybe we should wait, she said reluctantly. Save for another year or two until we have more capital. But James shook his head firmly. If we wait, we will always find a reason to keep waiting. There will always be more we could save, more we could learn, more preparation we could do. At some point we have to trust ourselves and take the leap. Even if we might fail, Eleanor asked. Especially if we might fail, James said. Because the alternative is living our whole lives wondering what might have been. I would rather fail trying to build something meaningful than succeed at merely surviving. His words echoed Eleanor's earlier thoughts about honoring her father's memory, and she knew he was right. They had to act, had to commit to their dream even though success was far from guaranteed. "All right," she said. "Let us do this. Let us find a piece of land, make an offer, and start building our ranch." They found the property 3 weeks later, 160 acres about 15 miles northeast of Mineral Park. The land was not ideal, covered with scrub brush and rocky soil, but it had two critical advantages that made up for its other shortcomings. First, a spring-fed creek ran through the property, providing reliable water even during drought years. Second, the price was low enough that they could afford it by combining their savings and taking a manageable loan from the bank in Prescott. "It is not much to look at now," James admitted as they stood surveying their future home, "but it has good bones. We can build on this." Eleanor gazed across the rough terrain, trying to see it as James did, trying to envision the ranch they would create here. It required imagination and faith, both of which she was still developing after 3 years of grimly realistic survival. But standing there with James beside her, his hand warm in hers, she felt something shifting inside her. The fear that had governed her decisions for so long was loosening its grip, making room for hope and ambition to take root. "When should we get married?" she asked, the question emerging more abruptly than she intended. James turned to look at her, surprise and pleasure mingling in his expression. "Whenever you want," he said. "Though sooner might be more practical than later. We are going to be living on this land together while we build the house and establish the ranch. It would be easier if we were actually married rather than trying to maintain propriety in the middle of nowhere." Eleanor had already considered that practical reality, but hearing James state it so matter-of-factly made her smile. "Very romantic," she teased, "proposing marriage for the sake of convenience." "I proposed marriage because I love you," James corrected, his voice turning serious. "The convenience is just a bonus." The words stopped Eleanor's breath. They had not spoken of love before, had carefully avoided that particular declaration even as they made plans for a shared future. Hearing it now, standing on the land that would become their home, felt momentous and right. "I love you too," she said, and was surprised by how easily the words came. "I think I have loved you since that first night when you sat down and asked to learn my father's rope patterns. You saw value in something most people dismiss, and that told me everything I needed to know about your character." James pulled her close, and Eleanor let herself sink into the embrace, into the warmth and solidity of another person who cared about her future as much as his own. They stood that way for a long time, holding each other while the wind whispered through the brush, and the Arizona sun beat down on the land they would transform together. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Mineral Park. Mrs. Blackwell stood as Eleanor's witness, and Tom Wheeler from the mine served as James's. The preacher was an elderly man who had seen countless young couples make similar promises, and his blessing was sincere if somewhat formulaic. Eleanor wore her best dress, a simple gray cotton she had made herself, and James wore clean trousers and a shirt he had borrowed from Tom. They had no money for rings, so James braided 2 bands from horsehair, following the pattern Eleanor had taught him, and they exchanged those instead. "These will not last forever," James said as he slipped the braided band onto Eleanor's finger. "But I promise you my love will." "And I promise you mine," Eleanor replied, placing the matching band on his finger. "From this day forward, we are partners in everything." The kiss that sealed their vows was brief and chaste, appropriate for a public ceremony, but Eleanor felt its impact all the way to her bones. She was married now, bound by law and custom to the man standing beside her. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying, the magnitude of what they had committed to settling over her like a weighty blanket. Mrs. Blackwell hosted a small celebration at the boarding house after the ceremony. Serving cake she had baked specially for the occasion, and wine she had been saving for years. A handful of James's co-workers from the mine attended, along with a few of the boarding house's permanent residents who had grown fond of Eleanor during her time there. It was not a large gathering, but it was warm and genuine, and Eleanor found herself unexpectedly moved by the goodwill of people she had considered mere acquaintances. "Take care of each other," Mrs. Blackwell said as she hugged Eleanor goodbye. "And remember, if things do not work out with the ranch, you always have a job here if you need it." Eleanor thanked her sincerely, though she had no intention of ever needing to take the older woman up on that offer. She and James were going to succeed, were going to build the ranch they had dreamed about during all those midnight conversations. Failure simply was not an option she was willing to consider. They spent their wedding night in the small hotel room James had been renting, and Eleanor discovered that physical intimacy with someone you loved and trusted was entirely different from the clinical mechanics she had been taught to expect. James was patient and gentle, attentive to her inexperience, and by the time dawn light began filtering through the thin curtains, Eleanor felt transformed. She was no longer just herself but part of something larger, connected to another person in ways she had never imagined possible. "Good morning, Mrs. Xavier," James said, his voice rough with sleep as he pulled her close. "Good morning, Mr. Xavier," Eleanor replied, testing out the new name. It felt strange on her tongue, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. She had been Eleanor Nash for 22 years, and becoming Eleanor Xavier represented a fundamental shift in her identity. She was no longer just her father's daughter but her husband's wife, her own person building her own life. They left Mineral Park 2 days later, their belongings packed into a wagon James had purchased with the last of his mine wages. The wagon was old and needed repair, but it was functional enough to transport their supplies to the property. They had already arranged to borrow tools from Tom Wheeler and had purchased basic necessities on credit from the general store, promising repayment once they sold their first cattle. The ride to their land took most of the day, the wagon creaking and swaying over the rough trail. Eleanor sat beside James on the bench seat, watching the landscape slowly shift as they left Mineral Park behind. The terrain grew rougher, more wild, populated by scrub oak and juniper rather than the cultivated gardens and organized streets of the town. By the time they reached their property line, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Home," James said simply, pulling the wagon to a stop near the creek. Eleanor climbed down and stood looking around at what was now legally theirs. 160 acres of rough land, a creek providing water and absolutely nothing else except possibility. They would have to build shelter, establish pastures, purchase stock, create everything from scratch. The enormity of the task ahead was daunting, but standing there with James beside her, Eleanor felt equal to the challenge. "Where should we start?" she asked. "Shelter first," James said practically. "We can sleep in the wagon for a few days, but we need something more permanent before winter comes. Even Arizona gets cold at this elevation." They spent the next week building a small cabin near the creek. It was rough work, cutting and hauling logs, notching and stacking them, filling the gaps with mud mixed with grass, and installing the canvas roof that would have to suffice until they could afford proper shingles. Eleanor worked alongside James, her hands blistering and her back aching, but she refused to complain or slow down. This was her dream too, her ranch just as much as his, and she would contribute equally to its creation. "You are tougher than most men I have worked with," James said one evening as they sat exhausted by their small fire, eating beans and hardtack for the fourth night in a row. "My father did not raise me to be delicate," Eleanor reminded him. "He raised me to be capable." "He did an excellent job," James said sincerely. "I could not ask for a better partner." The cabin was finished by early October, just one room with a fireplace at one end and their bedroll at the other, but it was theirs and it was solid. They celebrated by cooking a proper meal over the fireplace. Roasting rabbit James had trapped and vegetables Eleanor had purchased on their last supply run to Mineral Park. It was the best food Eleanor had tasted in weeks, made more delicious by the satisfaction of eating it in their own home. With shelter secured, they turned their attention to building corrals and fencing off pasture areas. The work was backbreaking, digging post holes in the rocky soil and stringing wire they had purchased on credit. Eleanor's hands became even more calloused, and she lost weight she could not afford to lose. But slowly, incrementally, the ranch began to take shape. In November, they made their first major purchase. Using most of their remaining cash and a loan from a rancher, Tom Wheeler had connected them with to buy 20 head of cattle and 2 horses. The cattle were young and not particularly impressive specimens, but they were healthy and properly branded, and they represented the foundation of the Xavier Ranch's herd. The horses were older but well-trained, capable of the hard work that lay ahead. "We are ranchers now," James said as they watched their small herd grazing near the creek. "Actual, legitimate ranchers." Eleanor nodded, feeling a surge of pride mixed with anxiety. The cattle represented their entire investment and the culmination of months of planning and preparation. If anything happened to them, if disease struck or predators got through their defenses, or any of 100 other potential disasters occurred, they would lose everything. The pressure of that responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders. As if sensing her thoughts, James put his arm around her waist. "We will protect them," he said. "We will check the fences daily, keep watch at night, do everything necessary to keep our herd safe. And next year we will have calves to sell, money to start paying off our debts and buying more stock. This is just the beginning." The winter that followed was the hardest of Eleanor's life. The cabin provided shelter but little warmth, and they burned through their supply of firewood faster than anticipated, requiring constant trips to cut and haul more. The horses needed feeding, the cattle needed watching, the fences needed repairing, and there were never enough hours in the day to complete all the necessary tasks. They survived on a monotonous diet of beans, cornmeal, and occasional meat from rabbits or deer James managed to hunt. Eleanor lost more weight, and James developed a persistent cough from too many hours working in the cold. But they also grew closer during those difficult months, their partnership solidifying under pressure. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, developed systems for dividing labor efficiently, discovered how to communicate through glances and small gestures. The physical intimacy that had begun tentatively on their wedding night deepened into something comfortable and familiar, a source of warmth and comfort during the long, cold nights. On Christmas Eve, they sat by the fire eating a special meal Eleanor had prepared using supplies she had carefully hoarded. There were no gifts to exchange, no decorations to admire, nothing but the two of them and the crackling fire and the cattle settling down outside. Yet Eleanor felt more content than she had on any of the more elaborate Christmases she remembered from her childhood. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, watching her face in the firelight. "I am thinking about how strange life is," Eleanor said. "A year ago, I was sitting in Mineral Park braiding rope and feeling like my life had ended with my father's death. I could not imagine ever being happy again, could not see any future worth working toward. And now here I am, married to a man I had not even met yet, living on a ranch we built with our own hands, and I feel more alive than I have in years. James reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "I know exactly what you mean," he said. "I spent 3 years drifting after my brother died, working jobs I hated and living day to day with no purpose beyond basic survival. Then I walked into Mineral Park looking for mining work, and I saw you sitting on that bench at midnight braiding rope, and something inside me just knew. I knew you were the person I had been searching for without realizing I was searching." "Do you ever wonder if we moved too fast?" Eleanor asked. "If we should have taken more time to get to know each other before committing to marriage and the ranch?" "No," James said without hesitation. "Because I do not think more time would have changed anything fundamental. We knew what we needed to know about each other within those first few conversations. Everything since has just been confirmation of what we already understood." Eleanor squeezed his hand, grateful for his certainty even when her own wavered. "I love you," she said. "I know I do not say it enough, but I do. I love you for seeing me as an equal partner, for valuing my skills and opinions, for working beside me rather than expecting me to follow behind. I love you for wanting to build a life rather than just endure one." "I love you too," James replied, "for your strength and your stubbornness, for your willingness to work until you drop, for teaching me your father's rope patterns and trusting me with your dreams, for taking a chance on a worn-out cowboy who showed up at midnight asking questions." They made love that night with particular tenderness, their bodies warming each other against the December cold, and Eleanor fell asleep feeling profoundly grateful for the unexpected turn her life had taken. Spring arrived in late March, bringing wildflowers and renewed energy. The cattle had survived the winter without loss, a minor miracle that Eleanor credited to their diligent care and sheer luck. Better yet, 3 of their cows had calved successfully, producing healthy offspring that represented the beginning of their herd's growth. "Look at them," James said, watching the calves nurse from their mothers. "That is our future right there. Those calves will be ready to sell by fall, and we can use that money to buy more breeding stock or pay down the loan." Eleanor shared his satisfaction but remained cautious. They still had months of hard work ahead before they could consider themselves even moderately successful. The calves needed to survive to sale weight, the cattle needed adequate grazing through the dry summer months, and they needed to avoid the countless disasters that could strike without warning. But as spring progressed into summer, Eleanor allowed herself to feel cautiously optimistic. The grass was growing well thanks to adequate winter moisture. The cattle were healthy and gaining weight, and she and James had developed an efficient routine for managing their small operation. They even had time for occasional leisure activities, including resuming their midnight rope braiding sessions that had brought them together. "I have been thinking," James said one night as they sat outside the cabin working on new lead ropes for the horses, "about expanding beyond just cattle. Maybe adding some horses to breed and train. There is good money in quality working horses, and we have the space." "That would require even more capital," Eleanor pointed out, "and horses are more expensive to purchase and maintain than cattle." "True," James acknowledged. "But they also bring in more money per animal. If we could develop a reputation for well-trained horses, we might be able to build income faster than with cattle alone." Eleanor considered the idea, turning it over in her mind. It would mean more work, more risk, more debt in the short term. But it would also mean diversification, multiple income streams that could sustain them if one market failed. "Let us see how our first cattle sale goes," she suggested. "If we do well, Maybe we can invest some of the profits in a couple of young horses to start building a breeding program." James agreed, and they continued their rope work in companionable silence. Eleanor had taught him all of her father's patterns by now, and James had become skilled enough to create beautiful, functional pieces on his own. Sometimes he surprised her with his innovations, finding ways to modify the traditional patterns to suit specific purposes. She loved watching his hands work, loved seeing the concentration on his face as he focused on the braid, loved knowing that her father's knowledge lived on through this man she had married. In July, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She had been feeling unusually tired for several weeks and had missed her monthly courses, but she had attributed both symptoms to the physical demands of ranch work. It was not until she experienced morning sickness 3 days in a row that she seriously considered the possibility. She told James that evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "I think I am carrying a child," she said simply, unsure how he would react. James turned to look at her, his expression cycling through surprise, joy, and concern in rapid succession. "Are you certain?" he asked. "As certain as I can be without a doctor's confirmation," Eleanor said. "All the signs are there." James pulled her into an embrace, his arms strong and reassuring around her. "That is wonderful news," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Scary but wonderful. We are going to be parents." "We are," Eleanor agreed, letting herself feel the full weight of that reality. A baby, a child, a new life entirely dependent on them for everything. The responsibility was enormous, added on top of the already considerable pressures of running the ranch. But beneath the fear, Eleanor felt excitement building. A child would mean family, would mean their partnership extended beyond just the two of them into the future they were building. "We will need to expand the cabin before winter," James said, already thinking practically. "Make room for a cradle, create more living space. And we will need to stockpile more supplies, make sure we have everything necessary for the birth and the baby's first months." Eleanor appreciated his immediate shift into planning mode, even as she felt overwhelmed by all the additional work required. "We also need to make sure the ranch is doing well enough financially to support 3 people instead of 2, she pointed out. "The baby will not generate income for years, only expenses." "Then we make this fall's cattle sale count," James said firmly. "We get the best possible prices and use that money wisely. We can do this, Eleanor. We can run the ranch and raise a child. Plenty of people have done both." "Plenty of people had family to help them," Eleanor countered. "We are completely alone out here." James was quiet for a moment, then said, "Maybe we should not be. Maybe we should reach out to Tom Wheeler, see if he would be interested in coming to work for us once his mine contract is up. He has ranching experience and he has been a good friend. Having another hand around would make things easier, especially once the baby comes." Eleanor considered the suggestion. Tom was a decent man, hardworking and knowledgeable, and James was right that extra help would be valuable. But hiring someone meant they would need to generate enough income to pay wages in addition to supporting themselves and the baby. "Let us see how the cattle sale goes," she said again. "If we do well enough, we can approach Tom about working for us." The pregnancy progressed through the hot summer months, and Eleanor continued working despite James's protests that she should rest more. She could not afford to rest, could not leave him to manage everything alone when there was so much that needed doing. But she did modify her activities, taking on lighter tasks and avoiding anything that required heavy lifting or serious physical risk. In September, they drove their calves and 3 older cattle they had decided to sell to the auction in Prescott. The journey took 2 days, and Eleanor, now 6 months pregnant, found the ride exhausting. But the sale itself exceeded their expectations, bringing in enough money to pay off their initial loan, buy supplies for the winter, and still have a decent sum left over for investments. "We did it," James said as they headed back toward their ranch, the wagon loaded with supplies and their pockets containing more money than either had seen in years. "Our first successful sale. We are legitimate ranchers now." Eleanor smiled, relief washing over her. They had proven the concept, had demonstrated that their ranch could function as a viable business. It was only one season, only one data point, but it felt like validation of everything they had worked so hard to build. "So do we talk to Tom about coming to work for us?" James asked. Eleanor nodded. "Yes, let us offer him a job and see if he is interested. Having extra help before the baby comes would be valuable." Tom Wheeler accepted their offer immediately, thrilled at the opportunity to leave the dangerous mine work and return to ranching. He arrived at the Xavier Ranch in early October, bringing his own horse and gear, and a wealth of experience that proved invaluable. James and Tom began working on expanding the cabin, while Eleanor focused on preparing for the baby's arrival, sewing tiny clothes from fabric she had purchased in Prescott and organizing supplies. The baby arrived in late January during a particularly cold snap. Eleanor labored for nearly 20 hours while James paced anxiously outside the cabin, and Tom rode to fetch the midwife from the nearest ranch, 8 miles away. By the time the midwife arrived, Eleanor was exhausted and frightened, but she pushed through with determination, focusing on the goal of bringing her child safely into the world. The baby was a boy, small but healthy, with a powerful set of lungs and a surprising amount of dark hair. Eleanor held him for the first time and felt overwhelmed by love so intense it was almost painful. This tiny person, this perfect combination of her and James, represented hope and future and possibility. "What should we name him?" James asked, his voice full of wonder as he gently touched the baby's miniature hand. Eleanor thought about her father, about the man who had taught her everything she needed to survive and thrive in a harsh world. "Jesse," she said. "Jesse Nash Xavier, to honor both our families." James smiled. "Jesse Xavier. I like it. Welcome to the world, son. Welcome to the ranch your mother and I built for you." The months that followed were exhausting but joyful. Eleanor recovered from the birth while simultaneously caring for a demanding infant and trying to maintain her share of the ranch work. Tom proved invaluable during this period, taking on additional responsibilities without complaint and showing surprising skill with horses that gave them new opportunities. "I have been thinking about that horse breeding program you mentioned last year," Tom said one evening in March. "I know a man in Prescott who raises good working horses. He might be willing to sell us a mare or two at a reasonable price, especially if we promise him first option on any foals we produce." James and Eleanor discussed the idea and decided to pursue it. They used part of their remaining savings to purchase 2 young mares and arranged to have them bred to a quality stallion Tom had identified. It was another risk, another investment that might not pay off, but it represented the kind of diversification they needed to build long-term stability. As Jesse grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to expand. They added more cattle, built additional corrals, and improved their cabin into a more comfortable home. Tom continued working for them, eventually building his own small cabin on the property and becoming almost like family. The horses they had purchased produced healthy foals that commanded good prices from local ranchers, establishing the Xavier Ranch's reputation for quality stock. By the time Jesse was 3 years old, the ranch was profitable enough that Eleanor and James could begin to relax slightly. to feel confident they had truly succeeded in building the life they had dreamed about during those midnight meetings 4 years earlier. They were not wealthy, would never be wealthy, but they had stability and purpose, and a future they were actively shaping. "You ever regret it?" Eleanor asked James one night as they sat outside watching the stars, just as they had done that first night in Mineral Park. "Taking a chance on a woman you barely knew, risking everything on a dream that could have failed." James looked at her with surprise. "Never," he said emphatically. "Not for one single moment. This life we have built together, this ranch, our son, the partnership we have created, it is everything I could have wanted and more than I dared hope for. You are everything I could have wanted and more than I dared hope for." Eleanor leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. "I never thought I would be this happy again after my father died," she admitted. "I thought the best parts of my life were over, that I would just exist until eventually I stopped existing. But you showed me I was wrong. You taught me that endings can be beginnings if you are brave enough to take the risk." "We taught each other," James corrected. "I was just as lost as you before I walked into Mineral Park and saw you braiding rope at midnight. You gave me purpose and direction, and a reason to build something lasting." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of their ranch, the cattle settling down, the horses moving in their corral, their son sleeping peacefully inside the cabin. This was the life Eleanor's father had prepared her for, the life she had described to James during that pivotal conversation when he had asked what she would do if fear was not a factor. Against all odds, they had made it real. "I think we should have another baby," Eleanor said suddenly, the thought emerging fully formed. James turned to look at her, surprised but pleased. "Really? You want to go through that again?" "I do," Eleanor confirmed. "Jesse needs siblings, and I want to fill this ranch with children who know how to work hard and think for themselves and build lives they are proud of. I want to teach them everything my father taught me, pass on his legacy to another generation." "Then we will have another baby," James agreed. "And another after that if you want. We will fill this ranch with little Xaviers and teach them all how to braid rope and work cattle and face life with courage." Eleanor smiled, imagining that future, seeing it clearly in her mind's eye. Children running across the land they had claimed, learning to ride and rope and think for themselves. Grandchildren eventually, carrying the Xavier name and the Nash legacy forward into an unknown future. A dynasty built not on wealth or power but on skill and determination and love. Their second child, a daughter they named Emma Rose, arrived the following spring. She was followed 2 years later by another son, John David, and then 3 years after that by twin girls, Sarah Jane and Mary Catherine. The cabin expanded multiple times to accommodate the growing family, eventually becoming a proper ranch house with separate bedrooms and a large kitchen where Eleanor taught her daughters to cook, while discussing mathematics and literature, and the importance of being able to support oneself. All the children learned to braid rope using their grandfather Nash's patterns, sitting with their mother at midnight when they got old enough, listening to stories about the man who had taught Eleanor everything important and the cowboy who had sat down one night and asked to learn. They learned to work cattle and train horses, to mend fences and treat sick animals, to read the weather and survive on limited supplies. They learned that capability mattered more than gender, that partnerships required mutual respect, and that courage meant taking risks when the potential rewards justified them. Tom Wheeler remained with the Xavier Ranch until his death at age 68, having become the children's honorary uncle and a valued part of the family. They buried him on the property he had helped build, marking his grave with a headstone that read, "Thomas Wheeler, Friend and partner, 1822–1890. Jesse grew into a capable rancher who eventually took over day-to-day operations, allowing James and Eleanor to focus on the horse breeding program that had become their specialty. Emma married a neighboring rancher's son and established her own operation on land adjacent to the Xavier Ranch. John went to California to study veterinary medicine, then returned to provide animal care services throughout the territory. The twins remained unmarried but became renowned horse trainers, their skills sought after by ranchers across Arizona and New Mexico. As Eleanor and James grew older, they spent more time on the porch of their ranch house, watching their children and eventually grandchildren work the land they had claimed 40 years earlier. The 160 acres had expanded to nearly 1,000 through careful purchases and wise management. The Xavier Ranch was known throughout the territory for quality horses and fair dealing, exactly the reputation Eleanor had dreamed of building during that midnight conversation when James had asked what she would do without fear. Did we do it? James asked one evening when they were both in their 60s, their bodies worn but their spirits strong. Did we build the life you described all those years ago? Eleanor looked out across the ranch, seeing cattle grazing in improved pastures, horses running in well-maintained corrals, children and grandchildren working and playing across land that bore their name. She thought about the scared young woman who had sat braiding rope at midnight, convinced her life had ended when her father died, unable to imagine a future worth pursuing. "We did," she said softly. "We built something better than I could have imagined. We built a legacy." James took her hand, his fingers still strong despite the arthritis that plagued them both. "We built it together," he said, "partners in everything just like we promised." Eleanor squeezed his hand, grateful beyond words for the cowboy who had sat down beside her at midnight and asked to learn something most people would have dismissed as unimportant. That simple request had changed everything, had opened a door to possibilities she had not dared consider. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important moments in life arrived quietly, without drama or fanfare, disguised as ordinary encounters that turned out to be anything but ordinary. They sat together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the Arizona sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. Somewhere inside the house, their grandchildren were laughing, the sound carrying clearly in the evening air. The cattle were settling down for the night, and the horses were moving peacefully in their corrals. Everything was as it should be, the result of 4 decades of hard work and partnership, an unwavering commitment to the dream they had forged together. Eleanor closed her eyes and could still feel the rope moving through her fingers, still remember the patterns her father had taught her so carefully. Those midnight hours of braiding had become the foundation for everything that followed, the skill that brought James to her side and gave them something to build on when they were strangers searching for connection. She had passed that knowledge to her children, who would pass it to theirs, keeping her father's legacy alive across generations he would never meet, but who would benefit from his wisdom nonetheless. "Thank you," she said quietly to James, her voice thick with emotion. "For what?" He asked, though she suspected he knew. "For sitting down that night," Eleanor said. "For asking to learn. For seeing value in me and in the things I knew how to do. For building this life with me, for being the partner I did not know I needed. For everything." James lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "The pleasure and the privilege have been entirely mine," he said. "You made me better than I ever could have been alone. You gave me purpose and family and a legacy I am proud to leave behind. If I could go back and live my life again, I would not change a single moment, because every choice, every hardship, Every success led me to that bench in Mineral Park where you sat braiding rope at midnight, and that is exactly where I was meant to be." They sat in the gathering darkness, two old people who had loved each other well, who had built something meaningful from nothing but determination and skill and mutual respect. When Eleanor finally died at age 73, surrounded by her children and grandchildren in the house she and James had built with their own hands, her last conscious thought was of that midnight encounter, of the cowboy who had asked to learn and change the entire trajectory of her existence. James followed her 6 months later, his heart apparently deciding it could not continue without its other half, and they were buried side by side on the ranch that bore their name, their graves marked with matching headstones decorated with braided rope designs carved in stone. The Xavier Ranch continued for generations after their deaths, remaining in family hands, growing and adapting to changing times while maintaining the core values Eleanor and James had established. Every Xavier child learned to braid rope using the patterns passed down from their great-great-grandfather Nash, and every one of them heard the story of how Eleanor Nash sat braiding rope at midnight, until a cowboy named James Xavier sat down and asked her to teach him, beginning a partnership that would shape their family for 100 years and more. It became a legend within the family, the founding story that explained who they were and where they came from. Young Xaviers would sit with their grandparents learning rope work and hearing about the courage it took to risk everything on an uncertain dream, about the importance of recognizing opportunity when it appeared, about the power of partnership between equals who respected each other's skills and contributions. The story was told at weddings and funerals, whispered to frightened children facing difficult decisions, invoked during hard times as proof that challenges could be overcome through determination and love. And sometimes, late at night when the Arizona stars blazed overhead and the ranch was quiet, family members would swear they could see two figures sitting on the old bench that had been preserved and moved to the ranch house porch. An old man and an old woman, their hands moving in perfect synchronization as they braided rope together, their love as strong in death as it had been in life, their legacy secured not through wealth or fame but through the family they had created and the values they had instilled. The Xavier Ranch stood as their monument, every acre and every building and every well-trained horse a testament to what two people could accomplish when they chose partnership over isolation, courage over fear, and love over loneliness. The rope patterns Eleanor's father had taught her lived on, practical and beautiful, functional and meaningful, connecting past to present to future in an unbroken braid that grew stronger with each generation, each strand supporting the others, each life interwoven with those that came before and those that would follow, creating something far greater than any individual could achieve alone.